Hi, everyone. It's great to be here with you today. I'm Jenny Abramson, and here we are on the eve of International Women's Day, reflecting from some great speakers on the past year, where we've seen a disproportionate effect that COVID-19 has had on women, as women have experienced more job losses, a greater burden of caregiving, less funding from venture capitalists, and I could go on. In my day job, I'm the founder and managing partner of Rethink Impact, the largest impact venture capital fund in the country dedicated to investing in women. Female CEOs, and we have certainly seen disheartening stats, but we'll talk about that and why I'm hopeful as well. More importantly, joining me for this session are some terrific speakers. We've got Henriette Kolb, the head of gender and economic inclusion at the IFC, Dr. Mekala Krishnan, a partner at the McKinsey Global Institute, and Sarah Thorn, the senior director of global government affairs at Walmart. Each of them brings a fresh and unique perspective of the impact of COVID on women. So my hope out of today is that everyone here will walk away with some data you didn't know, some interesting things to share on Monday, and a way to make a difference. So with that, let's dig in to the numbers as a starting point. There is an alarming amount of data on women leaving the workforce, racial disparities, and the burden of care. I know in my day job that, as a fund investing in female entrepreneurs, we are seeing funding levels for women-led companies at the lowest rates since 2017, despite the fact that overall venture capital funding has actually stayed on par with previous years. So Henriette and Mekala, you each come at this from a very different point of view. Share from your perspective how this pandemic has challenged women. Let's start with you, Henriette.
Thank you so much, Jenny. And first up, let me tell all of you and hope that you're well who are watching this and that your families are safe. We've seen at the World Bank Group and the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, that over the past year, gains we've worked so hard to make have quickly eroded. And let me just give you a couple of examples. So even before the pandemic, actually worldwide, we lost 172 trillion in GDP due to differential wage gap earnings between men and women, which is quite staggering. And now the loss of income and loss of jobs and loss of self-employment has, of course, exacerbated that. Then if you look at the capital gap, again, before the pandemic, women entrepreneurs around the world were already missing out on 1.5 trillion in SME financing. And the figures are worse for startup capital. So looking, sort of what happened throughout the pandemic, we took a really close look to see, and it's very nuanced, who's losing and who's gaining. There's very few who gained, and the majority have lost. And how far have they lost business opportunities in sales? So Facebook, OECD, and the World Bank Group have put out a survey that regularly looked at women entrepreneurs around the world and how the pandemic has impacted them. And what we found is that globally, women entrepreneurs were 5.9% more likely to have closed their business. But that really tells only a very superficial story, if you wish, because if you then look into the different regions, just to give you one example, in sub-Saharan Africa, we've seen actually the ratio being 41% of women having to close their business compared to 34% of men. So much bigger differences. And then you can take that even further. In Uganda, what we found is that, in fact, actually complete failure to have any sales was 61% for women entrepreneurs and 20% for men. So now,
where does the U.S. fall in all that? How does the U.S. compare?
Right, very similarly. And actually, what's really interesting is on the U.S. side, we also see much worse sort of impact for women entrepreneurs, but for minorities, even worse. So again, if you look into sort of just women as a package, that again does not tell you the full story. You need to be very careful and make sure that you get data points for minorities that are even further excluded. But just to give you a couple of reasons as to why that is. So one is, women entrepreneurs tended to be more in consumer-facing jobs. That's number one. And so that has had, obviously, much more of a demand shock impact. The second reason for that is that women, and we've heard that in, I think, every speaker said it very, very eloquently, it's not new, but women have care work, and it's already disproportionately higher before the pandemic. And with 1.1 billion kids out of school at the height of the pandemic, that has just increased, tremendously. Men, however, have done more care work as well. So I think we need to acknowledge that and say that. But still, women have really had a harder time. And then the last reason why women have not been able to cope as fast is the digital divide remains alive and well. Women are 23% less likely to connect and use the internet for entrepreneurship activities. And so shifting to online work, online payment services, online transport, and so on and so forth, e-commerce, all of that is not quite as easily available to every woman around the world as we would hope it to be. So I stop there and we come to solutions in the next round.
Let's shift to Mekala. Give us a couple-minute overview of your thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. And as Henriette said, we will talk about solutions. So this, I know this first part will feel quite downer, but there is light at the end of the tunnel. At least I hope so. So firstly, thank you for having this important conversation. I think Henriette, you teed up really well some of the issues that women are experiencing. Let me add maybe three more that are important to keep in mind. The first is women's participation in the world of work at all, right? And we've seen a few speakers describe this, but I think it's still important to emphasize. We did some research in July of last year, and what we found then was that while women had accounted for about 39% of the workforce pre-pandemic, they accounted for about 54% of the job losses that we had experienced to date at that time, and that was back in July. Since then, some of the statistics that have been emerging from countries suggest that labor market outcomes actually became worse for women. So, for example, when we look at the United States, we found that of about 1 million people that dropped out of the labor force between August and September, about 80% were women. We saw similar results when we looked at data from India, where women were withdrawing from the workforce at about 2.5 times the rate as men. So there was a period where there was substantial job losses and unemployment that was disproportionately being felt by women. I think the good news there is at least some of the emerging data from the United States suggests that that gap seems to be equalizing. Women seem to be returning to the workforce at similar rates to that of men, but there is still a gap, and there is still a risk that there are losses that we don't make up. So that's one kind of issue we need to manage. The second is the issues of the experiences that women are having in the workforce itself, right? And again, a few speakers have alluded to this, but I think it's very important to emphasize. We've done surveys that have covered 10 different countries across the world, and we asked employees what kinds of challenges they're experiencing. And firstly, of course, every employee is experiencing some form of challenge in this incredibly unique time. But across the board, what we find is that women are experiencing challenges in the workplace disproportionately. They are about 1.5 times as likely to report being concerned with mental health issues, feelings of burnout, isolation, anxiety, 1.5 times more likely to express that they have challenges with household work. So there's just not just the act of being in the workplace or not, but actually the experiences in the workplace. And then thirdly, the disruption that Henriette started to allude to, as we look ahead, what we've seen is that future of work trends have really accelerated during this time, right? Digital trends that were in place pre-COVID have really accelerated. And we know that that is a special challenge for women as they look to navigate the transitions that the future of work will entail. It will require new skills. It will require digital access. It will require job transitions. And all of these are hard for women. So many, many different challenges. I'll maybe end with saying, why do we care about this issue at all? So, of course, we care about this issue because it is the right thing to do. And if we don't take action today, there are hard-fought gains from the last few years that could stand to be lost. But there's also a real economic imperative to care about this issue. Our analysis would suggest that if we don't take action to manage some of the gender regressive effects, GDP in 2030 could be $1 trillion lower. However, if we act now in this moment, GDP in 2030 could be $13 trillion higher. So there is both downside risk and upside opportunity from this moment. So it's very important that we take concerted action today.
That's fantastic. Thank you for that overview. You know, Sarah, we've seen firsthand the massive impact that COVID has had on frontline workers. You know, even within our own portfolio, Rethink Impact, we've seen our companies that have stepped up to serve employees, whether it's Spring Health, which tackles mental health crisis that many of us are seeing, Future Fuel, which is tackling the student debt crisis. You'll hear from that CEO, former Googler, later today, or Winnie, which is a marketplace helping parents find affordable childcare locally. You're sitting at Walmart, which is known for leveraging its size and scale to improve the lives of women across the world. And you obviously have many, many frontline workers and employees. How did you pivot during the pandemic to continue to make gender equity a priority?
Thank you so much, Jenny. Yeah, it's an interesting place to be at Walmart right now, because if you think about it, we're a global retailer. So everything that we have experienced through the pandemic, we've experienced through the lens of frontline workers in the United States, back office workers in the United States, but also in Mexico, Canada, India, China, and have had to really pivot very quickly to make sure we're meeting the needs of our associates at all levels. It's also important to remember that over 55% of our workers are women. So all of the things that we've been talking about uniquely impact women and uniquely impact women in the service industry. So what I wanted to talk about, I know we have a very short amount of time. I'll talk first just about what we and how we responded in the United States to the pandemic, and then would love to talk a little bit more about our supply chain work as well, where we intersect throughout the supply chain with women. But in the United States, I would say we really took a values-based approach to every decision we made throughout the pandemic. So obviously the first important thing was safety. How do we make sure that our associates and our customers are safe, especially when there wasn't always guidance or regulation coming out consistently around the world? And so we had to make a lot of decisions about masks, about PPE, even thinking about, 6 feet and stores and plexiglass. Those were all decisions in some ways we all had to take on our own as an industry because there wasn't clear guidance. But certainly we knew enough about the virus to know that safety was paramount. And that was what we wanted to make sure. The second area that we had to work on clearly was security for our associates. So recognizing that there were so many more stresses, with schools closing, with unemployment, how do we make sure our own associates felt secure? And in some ways, that was really about making sure they felt valued and also giving them resources. So resources in terms of cash bonuses. In the United States, we paid more than $2.8 billion to our associates to make sure they had additional funds to cover those unexpected costs during the pandemic. And then, because the community and the retail community was so adversely affected, we made sure we were hiring from other retailers. So we've hired over 500,000 people. And we worked with 70 retailers to say, if you have associates and employees that are unemployed, let us come to us. Let's make sure we have a fast way to have them come in, and actually accelerated our hiring to a 24-hour period. And this also enabled our associates to have more flexibility because we were running our stores. We were an essential service, and we were actually having accelerated sales because people were responding to the demand cues. So by having more associates, we could give more flexibility and more certainty to our own existing associates. And then well-being. Very important to figure out how we had a COVID leave policy, which is actually in effect through July of next year, to make sure people, if they were sick or they had to quarantine, could do that and know that they had pay. 2 weeks up to 26 weeks. It's been called a model by the New York Times. But then also, if you are sick and it is a pandemic, what do you do? So one of the things we pivoted to, and this speaks to the digitization, is increased telemedicine. So we waived all the fees for doctor on demand, which is actually an incredible program. You get an appointment, you get a doctor, you can be diagnosed, they write prescriptions, and it cuts out that waiting room time for things that might be, could lead to bigger issues if you didn't have it diagnosed right way. And then lastly, mental health. Super important to have mental health. We've been engaging with Thrive Global. We've been providing mental health services for our associates because we recognize, like everybody, that this is just such an unusual time.
Sarah, let me ask you a quick question because I know we got to shift to the next speaker.
Yeah.
But if you look back, you've obviously done so much. Is there anything you would have done differently or done sooner?
Gosh, I think, I'm actually incredibly proud of the way we just made decisions about masks, decisions about providing for our community and stepping up. We've given over $35 million to Feeding America and just trying to be agile as we respond. Obviously, hindsight, should we have masked earlier? Should we make those? We had to rely on the best available science, and we had to recognize that there were prioritizations in terms of masking to first responders. So, yeah, obviously we would think everybody would have thought differently if we had better science and better availability. But, we did pivot to sourcing PPE. We've never done that before. Government asked us to source isolate gowns. Our teams kicked in. Very proud of their response.
Wonderful. So I'm going to shift for a moment, and I'm going to ask each of you to give me sort of your one thing. So take 30 seconds or less, just one thing that when you look based on your perspective, and you each come from a different one, you think about what are the investments that we need to make now, sort of looking forward, that you haven't made yet, or that the country hasn't made, or the world hasn't made, to sort of undo the regressive trends. You know, I think about the 700,000 parents with young kids that have left the workforce or been forced to leave in the last year. And I think about solutions like Winnie that we need to help with childcare in the pandemic. What do each of you see as the one thing that you would say we need to do more on this front? And I'll start with you, Henriette, first.
Not to copy you, but childcare is my number one and has been, in fact, as the IFC. It might be surprising for some of you that a development financing institution would lean into that space. In fact, we started this work quite some time back because we recognized that if we don't invest in our clients, our private sector companies we invest in, if we don't invest, we can all try retention and promotion methods. It's not going to be good enough. And so, interesting enough, the private sector has, I think, been at the forefront in many of the countries, including in Fiji, in challenging circumstances where they've leaned in and recognized that actually for them investing in childcare, and it doesn't need to be on-site, it can be off-site, it can be voucher, it can be community-based, is in essence actually saving them a lot of costs, but more importantly, really leads to working parents being much more satisfied and loyal to the company. But then we can't just stop there, the private sector. That's really where you have public and private have to come together. And so I'm so excited to share that actually in Fiji, which was hit by the pandemic and had 4 cyclones in the past year, the government said, we want to go hand in hand with the private sector and signed an MOU to put together this first ever childcare framework for kids under 5 in Fiji. But I could give you many examples from around the world where we've seen both public and private sector step up. And in fact, the Women Business and the Law report came out just last week and noted that in the past year, despite the pandemic, 27 countries have taken reforms, legal reforms that impact women and men to be able to equally come to the workforce. And in fact, parental leave policy revisions were one of the highest. So I'm hopeful, but we need every single one player, civil society, think tanks, private and public sector to come together for once and all.
Great.
Because this is not a new problem and challenge, right? So we need to get moving.
Great answer. And Sarah, what would you say? What are the investments that we need to make more of now?
So obviously echoing what Henriette has said and what the previous panels have said, but I think just from a different perspective, we have seen just the rapid digitization and the impact that access to digital tools has. Just even shopping online, the ability to stay safe and have, shop with your phone has been extraordinary in the downloads of our apps. But if you don't have access to a phone, if you don't have access to broadband, it's really difficult. And then I would also say education. We've almost leapt in the last year ahead of adoption of new digital tools and digital processing. But if you don't have people with the skills to take care of, to adapt to a new workforce, then that's also really difficult. So partnering, training, making sure that people are ready for the future, which seems to have landed on our doorstep faster than we would have anticipated, very important.
That's great. And Mekala?
So this is great because Henriette got my number 1, Sarah got my number 2. And so my number 3 was actually going to be, as companies think about their diversity, equity, and inclusion agenda, I think they need a renewed agenda for this moment. And it has a few pillars to it. The first, I think, is the fact that there are things that we've been talking about under this DEI umbrella for years that we've now done in the last year, right? Flexible work, virtual work, remote work, hybrid work. But I think we now need to take that to the next level. So while work has become flexible, it's also now pervaded our lives in a way that it hasn't before. So how do we think about that next level of the flexibility, virtual work, hybrid work agenda that allows people to balance work life and home life? So that's one part of an expanded DEI agenda. I think the other part of the expanded DEI agenda is there are new challenges for this moment. So thinking about mental health issues, as you referred to, Sarah, these issues of isolation, connectivity. What is the mandate for companies as they think about these other kinds of issues that employees and disproportionately minorities or women employees experience? What does that expanded agenda look like? And And then the third part is we're seeing more and more an imperative on the part of companies to think about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion outside of their four walls, right? Whether it is as they think about their supply chains, as you referred to, Sarah, as they think about the partners they collaborate with, as they think about their products and services. We've surveyed employees, and 9 out of 10 employees we surveyed said that their employers should play a role in DEI outside of their four walls. So it's also something that employees and organizations are asking of their employers. So I think just companies, as they look at DEI, it's not just enough to do what they were doing in the past well. I think it is now an expanded, deeper agenda that they need to think about looking ahead.
Wow, fantastic. So I have a few things I want to fit in. We don't have a lot of time left, but I have 2 things. One, as you think about learnings that we can take away from the pandemic, or things that are actually giving you hope for the future. We've spent a lot of this session talking about the challenges. For us at Rethink Impact, I think a lot about women's financial security in the future, right? We are in a company, I'm on the board of a company, Elevest, run by Sally Krawcheck, who many of you may know, it's just tackling the investment gap. And that sort of gives us hope. What's something, just a nugget that's giving you hope, the thing that you want people to leave here and look up afterward and say, oh, okay, I feel good about this. I'm going to ask each of you to spend 1 minute on one thing. Sarah, why don't you go first?
So I was thinking about this, and I'm actually encouraged that we're seeing gender being brought into a lot of areas with a renewed emphasis that in the past have been, nice to do. So specifically trade policy and looking at supply chains and trade policies and the impact on gender and making sure that women have a voice. I think that's a really exciting place. And I see it in the WTO. I see it in the Biden trade policy agenda, really digging in there as opposed to I think is incredibly important, and it gives me an awful lot of hope. And I'll stop.
No, that's a wonderful. That's great. Mekala.
Yeah, I think what gives me hope is the fact that if you think about the last year, we've done overnight things that we said were impossible to do, right? We've entirely changed how we work, how we think about work, how we think about different models of work that operate inside an organization. So I think what gives me hope is the fact that we can fundamentally rethink work and home life, and we can do it in a way that happens at scale across organizations, happens in different geographies that may have very different contexts, but we're still able to make shifts of this kind work when we're really forced to. So if we really now plan thoughtfully ahead, I think we can reinvent how we think about work life, how we think about home life, how we think about the care economy. I think we have the intrinsics within us to do this. And I think businesses have seen that, from a bottom line standpoint, it has not really detracted at all from how teams function, right? Of course, we've had to rethink how we do certain things. And there will be reinvention needed on the part of organizations. But I think we've proved to ourselves in this giant global experiment that we can make some of these things work.
That's a great point. Henriette, what do you think? Then I'm going to come back to you with each of you with one last question.
Great. So I don't know if you can see it. What gives me hope is that 1 out of my 10 sweet pepper seedlings has actually come through. So that's positive. Apart from that, lots of other things. The pandemic, in the very first time, and Sarah said that, has had a gender dimension that has really sort of gone from, an outside conversation among gender experts and technocrats to something that's really talked about in mainstream media. There's not one day where you don't open up the New York Times, The Guardian, or whoever, and read an article about the care impact or the women dropping out the labor force. And I think that's where conversations need to go in order to then catalyze actions. Talking about actions and just on the digitalization, one thing that gives me hope, as we have leapfrogged really, to online economies on payment, service, goods, transport, is that these companies that really absorb quite a bit of our capital recognize that women need to be part of both providers and users of those services. And to be specific, so for example, just one story I'd like to briefly share is PickMe, which is a Sri Lankan transport ride-sharing company that received a small investment from IFC. And actually, women were not really part of their driver's fleet. It was very much not part of the culture to have women drivers. And frankly, here in the US, we don't have that many women drivers. So it's very much consistent across the world. Women are not necessarily being part of the driver's fleet. During the pandemic, where the driving shifted from ferrying around passengers to ferrying around goods and services and eats and food, we had seen a rapid uptake in terms of women joining the driver force. And I think that's what we need to pay attention to, is where are some opportunities to bring women in to be fully participant into economic opportunities that are generated online more so than offline.
These are great answers, and what an incredible mix of perspectives you three bring. So I want to leave everyone, I'm so grateful to Mark DeCourcy and the entire U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation for bringing us together. But one of the things that many of us often feel, I think, who come to these events or speak at these events is you don't want it to be a moment in time. You want this to be a continued conversation. And so I want to ask each of you to, in your final answer, to really let people know there are so many people here with us today. What's the one place you'd send them to continue to learn more about either the work your organization is doing, or is there a person, or, what is the thing they should read? If it's a report, it doesn't have to be promoting for us, we're at Rethink Impact. I'm at Abramson Jenny on Twitter. That's sort of where we keep a conversation going about these things and about female entrepreneurs using tech to change the world. For each of you, what's the sort of one place you would send people to continue to learn and to continue this conversation, so that it's not a moment in time, it's not a special day on Monday, it's not even a month, it's an all year round conversation and change for women. So I'll start with you, Henriette, and then we'll shift to Sarah next.
Great. So I briefly spoke about it, Women, Business and the Law, just fresh hot off the press, an amazing resource for anyone that's watching. So I recommend that. And if you want a shortcut for a Twitter handle, at WBG_gender is everything gender and World Bank Group. So I repeat, at WBG_gender.
Fantastic. Fabulous. Sarah, any tip you want to give people to keep the conversation going? No pressure.
Yeah, I would recommend our ESG report, because I think you'll see that these issues aren't sidelined. They're part of our enterprise strategy. And we recognize that good companies are embedding this shared value approach, whether it's environment, social, governance, opportunity, as part of our long-term business strategies. So look at the ESG report, you'll see all of our information. And then we have a new renewed commitment to transparency. So we're doing biannual reports for equity, diversity, and inclusion. So you can see our statistics, and have also joined, try to be more transparent, the Bloomberg Gender Equity Index. So I think, at Walmart, what gets measured gets done. So that's why we're pledging to be more transparent and showing folks how we're making progress in this space.
That's great. And Mekala, what would you say? What's your tip?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have done a variety of research on this topic, both at the McKinsey Global Institute, but also in partnership with the Lean In Foundation, and just a long history of work on women in the workplace, as well as women more broadly in the economy and labor market. So our website, you can just Google McKinsey gender, and there's a series of reports that come up. I would say that's in terms of enhancing your knowledge and understanding of this topic and what our research suggests. The other tip I would suggest, a bit in line with what both Sarah and Henriette had alluded to in the previous question, is gender is a part of every decision that we're making today. And so I just encourage us, as we're living our day-to-day lives, to think about how to apply a gender lens to our decisions, right? So whether you're a manager thinking about your team, whether you're you're an executive making a big capital allocation decision, whether you are a supply chain manager thinking about the companies you source from, gender can be a part of every decision that you make. And so just asking yourself that question of, am I applying a gender lens to this decision, I think can go a long way in just opening our eyes to what is around us, the biases that exist, but also the opportunities that exist.
I couldn't agree with that more. And frankly, I'd take it even a step further, a lens of diversity of all kinds around every decision. I think this moment calls for it. And I think that, everyone rises together. So with that, I just want a huge thank you to our three fantastic panelists, and thanks to the Chamber for having us, and looking forward to the rest of the day and upcoming speakers.
Okay,
thank you so much, Jenny.